Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at Futura International Airways of Spain. Founded in 1989 and headquartered on the Spanish Balearic Island of Mallorca, the airline was a joint venture between the Irish flag carrier Aer Lingus, Belton Air and Banco Santander, with assistance from Guinness Peak Aviation, the aircraft leasing company. The airline was originally named CHIASA, or Compañía Hispano-Irlandesa de Aviación, which translated to English is the Spanish-Irish Aviation Company. CHIASA was quickly renamed Futura International Airways prior to starting operations. The new name was inspired by looking towards the future, particularly at the impending coming together of 12 nations to form the European Union, with the airline poised to take advantage of this. Futura was to be a leisure-oriented airline operating charter flights between Palma and the various countries in Northern and Western Europe. Unlike the growing number of charter airlines such as Air 2000, Britannia, Monarch and Air Europe, Futura would not be an in-house airline for a tour operator and instead operate as an independent carrier able to operate flights for any willing charter customer. Futura was also different to those airlines I've just mentioned in that it was based at the resort airport and would effectively operate in reverse to them, in that their outbound flights would be returning holidaymakers, then picking up new tourists for the flight back to Palma. While this limited their scope in terms of the range of resort destinations, it gave them a big advantage operating the other way, in that they could pick and choose their pick-up points without the need for ferry flights, awkward W patterns, or overseas bases. The new airline took delivery of its first aircraft in February 1990, a Boeing 737-400 delivered brand new from Boeing and leased from GPA. This aircraft was used on crew training and proving flights ahead of their planned launch day, and soon took delivery of a second aircraft in mid-May. Futura operated its first passenger flight on Thursday 17th of May 1990, with a flight from Palma to Manchester and back. Other early destinations included Dusseldorf, Frankfurt and Zurich. Two more 737s joined the Futura fleet, with one arriving in July and then another in December, with the latter being a second-hand frame but still relatively new. This particular aircraft had been in service with Pegasus Airlines, a Turkish charter airline that was also another joint venture involving Aer Lingus. Futura acquired two more Boeing 737s during the spring of 1992, though one of these would depart early the following year. The airline's livery consisted of a white fuselage with a small red and larger yellow cheat line sweeping up from under the forward fuselage, running towards the rear and then swooping up onto the tail. The company's interesting atomic logo featured prominently on the tail and always made me think of aerial washing powder. Two Boeing 737-300s were introduced in early 1993. Both were second-hand airframes, with both coming from Aer Lingus, though one had spent a few months with the Spanish airline Viva Air. Futura would have an on-again, off-again relationship with the smaller Boeing. Over the years, the airline would operate 7 of the type, but just for short periods, with the aircraft moving on to new operators within a year or so, as Futura preferred the larger 400 series model. Futura gained JAR 145 certification from the European Joint Aviation Authorities during 1993. This allowed the airline to open and operate its own aircraft maintenance facilities. While heavy maintenance would be undertaken by Aer Lingus and later FLS Aerospace, Futura was able to offer services to a number of European airlines and, crucially, take advantage of a lucrative source of cash. Futura also discovered another revenue stream, aircraft subleasing. Having already built up a fleet on favourable leasing terms from its part owner, GPA, Futura was able to sublease some of its fleet out for a considerable profit during the leaner winter seasons. Futura would place its aircraft with operators across the globe, including Trans-Brazil, Air Berlin, AMC Airlines of Egypt, Jet Airways of India and Ryan International of the USA, amongst others. Back in Europe, Futura was growing steadily whilst keeping its finances in check. Remarkably, for a near constantly expanding airline, Futura continued to turn a profit during the 1990s. In the winter of 1996, Futura opened an overseas base in Tenerife. Again, it had the same premise of bringing in tourists from across Europe in search of that lovely winter sun. Luxair would provide a 737-400 on a winter lease for 1996 and 1997. When the Tenerife base went full-time, Futura would base its own aircraft there. Futura would also establish another base, this time a bit closer to home in Malaga on the Spanish mainland. Futura would also begin to dabble with scheduled operations under the name Futura Direct. The airline began to sell seats on existing charter flights, starting with flights between Palma and London Gatwick. Futura continued to grow steadily towards the new millennium, with the airline gaining more and more contracts with European tour operators, all in need of a safe and reliable airline to take their tourists to Iberian resorts. I say Iberian as by now Futura were also serving Faro and Lisbon, both in neighbouring Portugal, via W patterns, where an aircraft would leave Palma for, say, Hamburg, then head to Faro before doing it again in reverse. Futura would heavily utilise W patterns as a way of serving multiple destinations each day using their limited, albeit steadily growing fleet of aircraft. In February 1999, one of Futura's 737-400s was placed with the French charter airline Corsair. The aircraft would spend the summer with Corsair, and unlike most of Futura's other outplaced aircraft which retained Futura livery and their temporary operators' titles, this one would wear the full Corsair livery. Speaking of liveries, Futura had gradually adjusted theirs in favour of a more Euro-white style, with just the tail design remaining unchanged. As the new millennium approached, the airline decided on a new, and to quote their press release, fresh image. The yellow was dropped altogether, the tail would now be blue and feature an updated Atomic Futura logo. The fuselage would be entirely white with Futura titles now in blue instead of red. It did look good and perhaps more modern than the original design, but it also felt more generic. In the spring of 1999, Futura leased a Boeing 737-800 from the Dutch airline Transavia. The aircraft had been brought in by Futura in order to gain experience with the type, as they were expecting delivery of their own 800s later in the year. A second 737-800 would be hired from Transavia in October, with both of them staying until the following April. Both would wear a sort of hybrid Futura livery. They had a white fuselage, Futura titles and a blue tail, but no tail logo. Futura took delivery of its own Boeing 737-800 in November 1999. A second aircraft would arrive in December. 4 more 737-800s would join the Futura fleet during the spring of 2000 as the airline steered towards an ultra-modern fleet. That's not to say the 737-400 was too old for Futura. While the airline had either withdrawn a few aircraft or leased out some of the fleet to other airlines, Futura would continue to bring in more aircraft alongside its growing fleet of 737-800s. On a side note, one of the departing Futura 737-400s would move to Cyprus and become the first aircraft in the Helios Airways fleet. By the dawn of the new millennium, Futura had expanded beyond charter flights to Spanish and Portuguese destinations to the Greek islands such as Corfu, Kos, Rhodes and Zakynthos. Futura was even going further afield, to Kiev, Tel Aviv and even St. Petersburg, as the airline grew to become one of Spain's leading privately owned airlines. The downturn in the aviation industry following the September 11th attacks would have an effect on Futura. While the airline itself was doing okay, largely due to it primarily being a leisure airline and supported by its subleasing business, one of Futura's largest shareholders, Aer Lingus, had been hit hard. The Irish flag carrier found itself hemorrhaging cash. It had to cut staff, routes and its fleet, and thus come November 2002 the airline had sold most of its stake in Futura. Aer Lingus would retain 20%, with the Spanish financial group, Corfin Capital, taking a majority holding of 67%. Despite the change in ownership, Futura still looked in good shape. The airline had picked up another 737-800 during the spring of 2002 and had several more on order. Some of the older 737-400s left during this transition period. On a personal level, the most notable one was Echo Charlie India Fox November, which left in April 2003 to become Tango Foxtrot Echo Lima Delta with Islands Flug, and the last 737-400 that I would work on as cabin crew come the winter of 2005. The winter of 2003 saw Futura place 3 aircraft with Ryan International. Ryan, which is an episode all to itself, had a number of contracts with tour operators such as Transglobal Vacations and Apple Vacations. The airline would hire aircraft from various European operators over the winter season in order to fulfill its charter contracts. Futura had been a long-standing provider of aircraft going back to the mid-1990s. Futura would place 1 737-400 and 2 737-800s with the North American carrier. Futura would continue to grow with the airline bringing in 3 more 737-800s during 2004 and another 3 in 2005. The airline also phased out some of their older 737-400s during 2005, with 3 of the type leaving during the year. Futura also continued to sublease a portion of its fleet out to other airlines alongside its own airline operations. This extra revenue stream would help the airline with both its fleet renewal program and its steady growth. The Futura fleet grew further in 2006 with the addition of 2 more Boeing 737-800s. The company as a whole grew too with the formation of FlyAnt, a cargo operator. The new venture would be headquartered alongside Futura in Mallorca, however it would focus its operations on Madrid. FlyAnt was certainly an interesting name. I like their tail design, although I doubt it went down with sufferers of myromycophobia. In 2007, Futura established yet another airline, Futura Gael. This new venture was a creative workaround to allow Futura to operate flights from the Republic of Ireland to destinations outside of the European Union, such as the Canary Islands and Egypt. The airline would use some Boeing 737-400s and 737-800s transferred from the main Futura operation. These aircraft would wear a slightly modified Futura livery with the addition of Gael titles. Gael itself, when translated from ancient Gaelic, means Irishman, very fitting for an Irish airline. Futura had previously dabbled in an Irish operation of sorts, operating flights on behalf of the Irish travel company Budget Travel during 2004 and 2005. An aircraft would be based in Dublin and sport additional Budget Air branding on its existing Futura livery. Budget Travel was owned by TUI, but used Futura rather than one of their own airlines to operate flights. As the Budget Air destinations were all within the EU, there was no need for Futura to set up a separate airline operation. Coincidentally, Futura operated an ex-Britannia Nordic 737-800 around this time, with the aircraft retaining its TUI blue livery but with Futura titles and logos in their place. The main Futura fleet also grew during the year, with the addition of 2 further 737-800s. The company was still doing well with its aircraft subleasing operation too. Futura had several aircraft placed with other airlines during the year, including Airways, Air Slovakia, Archifly, Biinter Canarias, Cirrus Airlines, Jet2, Merpati and Garuda, with the last 2 being Indonesian carriers. While things look good on the airline front, at corporate level things were less stable. Futura, which had already undergone a bit of an ownership change, found itself undergoing a management buyout. Both Aer Lingus and Corpfin Capital sold their stakes in the company, with the British-based investment fund Hutton Collins acquiring a 46.5% stake in Futura, with the management and employees owning the remaining 53.5%. The MBO came at a bad time, however, as the global economy began to tank in early 2008. In an effort to reduce losses, Futura's cargo airline, FlyAnt, began to operate some passenger flights on behalf of its parent. FlyAnt, however, didn't have any passenger-configured aircraft and instead operated some of the existing Futura fleet, making the whole exercise pointless. Despite the company's finances on the slide and the airline's future looking a little shaky, it was not all doom and gloom, though one could certainly say things look particularly gloomy given how one of Futura's 737s was involved in a ground collision at Manchester Airport during the summer. The 737 bound for Tenerife taxied too close behind a Lufthansa A320 and lost a winglet for its trouble. On the less gloomy side of things, the spring of 2008 saw Futura take delivery of 2 brand new Boeing 737-900ER aircraft, becoming Europe's first operator of the type and beating the UK's XL Airways to that title by mere days. Just like XL, however, Futura's days were numbered. Questions were being asked regarding the viability of the airline, given its financial state in the worsening global economic crisis. Could Futura survive competition from the much larger Spanair? Could it fend off competition from foreign charter airlines? The answer was no. Futura abruptly ceased operations at midnight on Monday, the 8th of September 2008. The airline cited debts of around €50 million as the cause of their grounding, and that a lack of cash prevented the airline from continuing operations in its current form. Both Futura Gael and FlyAnt were also grounded, with one Futura Gael aircraft making a lucky escape. The flight from Dublin to Madrid had been delayed by nearly 3 hours due to paperwork issues and eventually departed just before 10 p.m. By the time the aircraft had landed in Madrid, Futura had been grounded. At first it looked like the grounding may have been temporary, but within days the Futura fleet were being repossessed by their respective owners and flown off to new airlines. The Spanish Civil Aviation Authority would revoke Futura's operating licenses 2 weeks after the grounding, once it had established that the airline had no viable plan for returning to operations. Unlike Futura and Futura Gael, however, FlyAnt's grounding was only temporary. The airline briefly resumed cargo operations before ceasing operations in December 2008. It was then sold to an investment group for just €1 and resumed operations in October 2009 under the name Satius Air. It would find itself permanently grounded in December 2010, however, bringing this story to a close. So, what went wrong? The collapse of Futura could really be put down to two things happening with very bad timing. The airline underwent 2 changes of ownership in pretty quick succession, with the latter being a well-intentioned but badly timed management buyout. This MBO would see the money used to acquire the company come from using the airline's assets as collateral, effectively putting the airline in debt from the get-go. Futura had already seen a decline in profits over the previous few years, and the MBO saddled it with more debt. The global economic crisis, of course, played a huge part in the airline's downfall. Aside from seeing a decline in charter contracts with tour operators, Futura also saw a reduction in its aircraft leasing operation. The subleasing business had been very good for Futura over the years, helping keep the airline profitable. However, 2008 saw a number of contract negotiations fall through, leaving the airline with more aircraft than it needed and, crucially, less money coming in. In Futura's final months, it did manage to place some aircraft out on new contracts. The airline placed a 737-800 with Sun Express of Turkey, a 737-400 was sent to Jet Airfly of Belgium, and one sent to Aerolínea Principal in Chile, an airline which Futura had been providing technical support to for a number of years. Futura also had some aircraft out on long-term placements, but it wasn't enough to keep the airline afloat. Futura's prospects were looking bleak due to competition too. There was competition from the country's flag carrier Iberia. Both Spanair and Air Europa had grown over the years too, and 2 of Spain's low-fare airlines, Vueling and Clicker, merged in the spring of 2008. Competition from overseas airlines was fierce too. Many charter airlines had merged to form stronger entities in the face of a changing market. Low-fare airlines such as EasyJet and Ryanair had expanded rapidly as well, particularly on leisure routes, and were eating away at the profits of the more traditional charter airlines as folks began to drift away from package holidays. In a way, there was a parallel between the collapse of Futura and the XL Leisure Group. Both had undergone management buyouts which had saddled the companies with debts. Both were early casualties of the global economic crisis, and both collapsed within days of each other, Futura on September the 8th and XL on September the 12th. I should point out though that the XL collapse was far more complicated and involved some dodgy dealings from its previous owners. While XL was sadly doomed to fail, Futura might have survived had the recession not begun to bite, but sometimes that's how the cookie crumbles. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or criticisms, please do get in touch. If you don't have a YouTube doodah, don't worry, I've got a contact form on my website, and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. I have plenty more episodes in the works, so if you haven't already, why not subscribe to catch them as they land? And as always, thanks for watching.